Okay, so one more time, good afternoon, and welcome to this science policy debate. My name is Agata Conchal, and together with Kriegenick, we will moderate this event for this afternoon. So forest has been the focus of policy debates in Europe and beyond. Policymakers have stressed the need for timely information from science, and there have been ongoing discussions about how to best design the science policy interface. The discussion has been accelerated by increasing urgency related to environmental change and debates on, in example, conservation and use or sustainable management. Scientists want their knowledge to be recognized and applied to have an impact. Policymakers at the same time may struggle with complex or contradicting advices and also may defend their space for decision-making. Funding communication channels and understanding each other's needs, it's crucial for science policy interface. Providing information and possibilities to participate in decision-making for a larger set of interested society, it's an additional demand that is aligned with the idea of increased transparency and shared decision-making in pluralistic society. So, do we need a new science policy interface for forests in forestry? This question we will discuss today with our panelists. Before we start, some housekeeping rules. So all of you are warmly welcome to ask questions during the entire panel via question and answer box. We will pick them up during the question and answer series. We also may ask you to ask this question live, so be prepared. We will warn you, and then we will give you possibility to unmute yourself and also to use your video. We are also very happy to announce that for this event, there will be a graphic recording by Alex Gurka, who is a researcher and artist, and also one of the organizers of the previous IFPM event. And now I will ask Georg to introduce shortly the agenda and also share some unexpected and sad news.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much, Agata. We are in a very special setting because we can see ourselves, but no one else. So I just hope we're not talking only to ourselves. But it seems there are quite many more people in the room. Yeah, welcome to the, I see now one of the panelists, also fantastic, hello Jürgen. Nice to see you all and welcome to the last event of the day. Of this first day of the International Forest Policy Meeting. We have a, I hope, very nice agenda. We start with two short social science interventions, as we called them, or keynote interventions, I don't know exactly, by two quite experienced colleagues who worked a lot on the science policy interface. Then we have four Guinea pigs, policymakers and scientists that are very active and very well known and experienced at the science policy interface for discussion. Unfortunately, and this is the sad news, we have one last minute cancellation because one of our panelists fell sick, but I have her speech here, so I will turn into her role at least for the introductory speech and at least for one day, for 3 minutes, become a policymaker finally. Then the idea is to have a bit of a chat in the panel, but we really want to soon open up for comments and debates, open up to everyone, and because I think this should be really interactive. Yeah, and with that, did I forget anything? I think I will ask you 10 times today about that.
I think we are all set and we can start with the keynotes.
So then it's my big pleasure to introduce Michael Kriegenick from University of Freiburg. He's a professor of sustainability governance there at the Institute. I hope it's still called like that, Environmental Social Sciences and Geography. It was called when I was there a long time ago. So quite resistance to change, it seems, the name. Congratulations. At Albert Ludwigs University of Freiburg. And Michael is focusing on the nexus of sustainability, science and society. And he is quite an expert. I think you did your habilitation on science policy interfaces. Michael, we very much look forward to your intervention, telling us a bit about different ideas of how science policy interfaces work, I believe. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you very much. I will try to share my screen with you and you tell me whether it works or not. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, then thank you very much. So thanks especially to you, Agata and Georg, for inviting me to provide this first scientific intervention to this panel. And as the subtitle of the panel asks, do we need a new science policy interface for forests and forestry? I would like to meet the expectations of the organizers and try to address this question right away. But in good scientific practice, not by answering it, by countering, but by countering it with another question, which is, if a new science policy interface is seen as the solution, then what do you see as the problem? So this may sound like a bit of an absurd question, but the argument that I want to make out is that by spelling something out as an interface problem, you already take sides and you see something as problematic, and you also see possible solutions to this problem in a certain way and blind out other things. One thing is for sure that in recent years, this notion of the science policy interface has been very prominent as a metaphor, both in the scholarly and in the policy realm. Whenever you draw on the interface, you have a certain way of how you see it. But there are also other metaphors of how the problem could be seen and has been seen. A few decades ago, maybe you would have used the more linear notion of knowledge transfer. Today, this knowledge transfer metaphor has morphed into the more modish idea of science communication, with some scholars even highlighting the significance of storytelling as part of narrative policy frameworks. As you heard, or most of you probably heard in the keynote by Sina Leipold earlier today, notions like knowledge brokerage or boundary spelling would, for example, point out the more reciprocal or negotiated character of scientific advice. Also very prominent in the debate is the call for more evidence-based policymaking, but at the same time, we also hear voices pointing almost in the exactly opposite direction, not to depoliticize policymaking by means of evidence, but to politicize science with explicit calls for science advocacy and activism. Now, how to make sense of such a polyphony of different, partly even contradictory explanations and related recommendations? Today, I don't want to bring one hegemonic framework, but rather point out or ask the question, what is behind those different labels? And especially asking on which conceptualizations of the political do those models build. And I will introduce 4 to most of you quite well-known models of policymaking. First, always introducing the rationale of this model, and then asking the more interesting question for us, what is the role of science and expertise therein? So the first model that I would like to discuss is the technical rational model. So here, like in business management, the political process would be seen as a sequence of logical steps. First, you define your goals, then you develop alternatives for solutions, you evaluate them, and then you choose the option that brings the most or the highest social outcome. How does expertise come into play here? Expertise in this model, of course, is very much the linchpin of technical rationality per se. So there are numerous assumptions built in this model, a separation between scientific facts and political values, but also this idea that first scientific questions need to be resolved, the product is handed over to policymakers, and then comes the policy process that formulates policies. In the literature, this model is often described as the linear model of knowledge transfer. In light of recent scholarship, this model has been criticized quite a lot, theoretically, empirically, but what you still see is that it still very strongly dominates perceptions among policymakers, among scientists, but also among designers of science policy interfaces. Rainer Grundmann once even called it the natural ideology of our modern knowledge societies. This idea of technical rationality is challenged in a very fundamental way by a second group of models, which I would call here polycentric models. Here, the decision-making process is seen as more random, more anarchical. There are various approaches like disjointed incrementalism, also known as salami politics, the garbage can model, the notion of policy soups, multiple streams. What unites all these approaches is simply that policymaking is seen as largely or far more non-linear and incremental. Now, what is the role of expertise seen herein? In the more radical form, like the garbage can, they don't put much hope into expertise because the policy process is simply seen as far too chaotic for useful cognitive input. But in more moderate variants, you can see that political actors or knowledge actors can unfold influence, for example, by helping political actors to recognize their interests, frame issues, or identify salient points for negotiations. Power and interests also play a key role in the third group of models. Here, rational choice, public choice models would conceptualize political actors as being oriented towards self-interests, pushing for the maximization of their utility, which is not the same as maximum social welfare as in the first model. And policy outcomes you can best explain by looking at actors, by looking at interests, by looking at power resources. Again, the question, what's expertise have to do with that? In blunt terms, here expertise would come in as a political resource that actors can mobilize. Scientific knowledge can fulfill various functions, from serving as a source of authority and legitimacy, an instrument for persuasion in debates, justification for inaction, or just post hoc justification for decisions that have already been taken on political grounds. And I guess every one of you who is attending or watching news or reading newspapers would concede that many of the described patterns are quite familiar to us. At the same time, this rational choice approach also has been criticized recently. And one of the qualifications is that in today's complex settings, policymaking is not so much about problem solving, like in Model 1, or power play, like in Model 3, but more about framing the setting of norms. And this is where my fourth category comes in, argumentative models, which put a greater emphasis on language, on meaning making. And with that, the classical concepts of policy analysis, which this is a problem, this is an alternative, this is a solution, would no longer be seen as essential categories that are just out there to be identified, but they are seen as socially constructed and negotiated. Again, what's the role of expertise here? In general, we see an increased pluralization of knowledge types and knowledge holders. As a consequence, science has lost much of its divine appeal. We see increasingly confrontation between expertise and counter-expertise. Some of that we might also see maybe in a minute in our panel discussion. And all that could be now either be interpreted as a lack of scientific trust or social trust in science, but before the background of a political theory of agonistic pluralism, one could see or interpret these confrontations also as, quote, practices of alternative knowledge mobilization and co-production that simply challenge official techno-scientific assessments of safety and risks, as my colleague Christina Espinosa pointedly spelled it out in a recent paper. With that, I come close to my 10 minutes that I have, and I also want to close my kaleidoscope of theoretical perspectives. So in how far might that all be relevant for European forest policy, or maybe more modestly for our upcoming panel discussion? So what I wanted to show is that the question of what role for expertise very much depends on how you perceive what is the political and how does policymaking look like. And I think that all four models that are introduced could bring some relevant insights for us. While the technical rational model has often been seen as outdated, I still see merits in it. First, it still serves as an ideal, because who of you would be against well-minded policymaking? So the enlightened policymaking model is still a normative benchmark, but also in more empirical grounds in the field of forest management especially, there are a number of great, more routine tasks for which nice, good socio-technical solutions are more than good enough. Just in order to avoid technocracy, it's important that all assumptions and hidden value judgments would be made explicit. And this is where explicitly the other three models would come in. Polycentric models, I guess, have reminded us of the fact that it's important to see policymaking as an iterative process and therefore ask for possibilities for experimentation and social learning in science policy advice. Rational choice approaches have made us aware that it would be naive to see scientific advising as policy or value-free. So rather not try to depoliticize controversies, but rather repoliticize them and provide opportunities for deliberation. And lastly, before the background of the last group of models, I would follow what Sheila Jasanoff once called a call for professional humility, which is us scientists openly addressing that there are uncertainties and cognitive limits to our scientific expertise. And now finally, let me answer the question of whether we need a new science policy interface. I would say yes, but not so much because there is still a deficiency in the transfer of scientific knowledge into policymaking, but more because I think we have not yet found a proper place for expertise, forest-related expertise in democratic decision-making. And I'm already curious to hear what Esther, as the next speaker, and then the panel has to say on that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was an excellent introduction in 10 minutes about the different ways of thinking about science policy phases and interactions. And I have to admit, your presentation of the polycentric model reminded me that this has been a long day, quite some nice food there, but I hope we can still keep us happy with the intellectual food we have in the afternoon. And I'm now happy to hand over to Agatha, who will introduce our next speaker. Yes. And please put questions and comments for Michael in the chat. We have a quite tight beginning of that, but we have time for discussion later.
Exactly. We already have some questions in the question and answer box. Please keep putting them there. Lucas, we already got yours question. You can be sure that we will ask you to ask this question live. So please be ready. And now I have a great pleasure to introduce the next keynote speaker, Esten Kulhap. She is a chair of Science, Technology and Society at University of Twente. She is the academic director of the Netherlands Graduate Research School of Science and Technology Studies. She is an interdisciplinary social scientist, drawing on STS and political theory approaches to analyze relations between knowledge, policy, and society. Most of her work is environmental domain, including forests and nature, biodiversity, and sustainability. Please, Esther, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. I'll try to share my screen. I think that should work. Are you now seeing the full screen or is it weird? All right. So thank you very much. I'd like to start by really thanking Michael for creating such a fantastic basis for me to proceed on and to build on. Indeed, I think the question of what is the proper place of knowledge and research in democratic decision making is exactly the right question to ask. And it is also the question to ask whenever this question comes up. Do we need a new IPCC4, whatever? Do we need a new science policy interface? We need to ask ourselves, why is this question being posed? What is then expected of knowledge and research in order to accomplish? And actually also, should we, as a research community, play along? So in that sense, my story on this will perhaps be a bit more of a personal reflection on my experiences in both studying and participating in these science policy interfaces, and particularly based on my experiences with IFPS, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So first of all, as Michael also explained, the relation between science and governance, I'll be talking mostly on the global level, has been sort of organized or structured in terms that is called the linear model. And you see this in the mission statements of both IPCC and IFPS, that there is this idea that knowledge and research can help develop policy and can help create better decision making. I don't actually disagree with these statements. I think they can, but they can also do the exact opposite. They can also create bad decisions or justify legitimate bad decisions and bad policy outcomes. And in many cases, this is not deliberate, but it sort of happens. And it happens because I think we don't ask ourselves the question of what is our role in democratic societies, and with what legitimacy and authority do we convey scientific messages to these audiences. So, and perhaps this is not needed for an audience like this, but clearly one of the key problems of the linear model is that it sees science and policy, or research or knowledge and policy, as separate. But of course, everybody will recognize that facts do not speak for themselves. So in order for science to have meaning, to get meaning, framing is necessary. And in that sense, every act of producing knowledge, every act of communicating knowledge to whatever audience becomes a much more modeled affair where facts and values are entwined. And these frames and the knowledge that is articulated in these frames can strengthen specific dominant framings of environmental problems. They can marginalize other framings of environmental problems. And in so doing, they actually do shape the solutions, and not enough reflection is going on who is actually benefiting from research and who is not. Particularly when you look at the inequities within knowledge systems, but also the inequities between knowledge systems, including different status, different funding, and different capacities, can easily lead to certain frames gaining dominance over others, and a lack of critical questioning and scrutiny of these frames. And one example that I will offer is by somebody who I really admire, Julia Steinberger, who has said about the IPCC models the following thing. So within the IPCC models, we have entire things like imaginary technologies, like carbon removal from the atmosphere, that are only in the models in order to protect existing powerful industries. And the reason why these things are in the models is because without them, the Paris Agreement would not have been possible. But right now, they are all, as we are seeing after Glasgow, they're also in the model in order to shift the debate in climate change from actual emission reductions to this concept of net zero. So in that sense, the IPCC modeling of technologies that do not exist and have major social and political issues associated with them that makes it unlikely that they will exist at scale in time, means that knowledge does political work. And in this case, the IPCC have strengthened certain framings of the problem and has neglected other framings. So the question that Julia asks herself, and I do too, is how can at least knowledge and research stop contributing to making things worse? So based on this general notion of the politics of knowledge and the role of framing, the urgent question that we need to ask whenever this question comes up, if we need an IPCC for whatever, and we have seen several proposals actually, is what is the political work that such a body is expected to do? And then as a result, as a follow-up question, who and what will benefit or be marginalized? So I've been involved in trying to address this question in a number of different contexts, including in 2012 when IPBES was created, but also more recently in the domain of food, where actually also this call was launched by the UN Food System Summits, whether we need an IPCC for food systems. Well, me together with a couple of other authors started to ask ourselves, well, what do we know about food systems? We know that there are well-known knowledge inequities. And I put this example here of this Nature editorial, which explains that that less than 5% of all agricultural research is relevant to the needs of smallholder farmers. And also in the climate domain, we have seen that 90% of all funding goes to natural science approaches, with social sciences and other approaches receiving a very small portion of that funding. So there's well-known knowledge inequities. There's also well-known knowledge controversies, as an earlier global assessment of agriculture made clear. These knowledge controversies are quite persistent. And there's high interests, and there is no global convention. So who will actually listen to these, to the outcome of this imagined IPCC for food, was the question that we asked. And quite similar to actually our intervention when IPBES was created, we ended up being quite critical about whether we need a new science policy interface for food systems. And I think there are parallels with forests that the panel is in a much better place to address than I actually am. But we saw that there's already things in place. So if people are not happy with the institutions that were already in place, we need to ask ourselves why there is this expectation that a new organization will not repeat these very same problems. Second, we saw that the science-dominated approach in this context of food would run real risks of suppressing knowledge controversies, exacerbating knowledge inequities, and marginalizing not just alternative food systems knowledge, but also, as a result of that, alternative food systems themselves. The conditions that we ended up with for a legitimate, possibly, but not effective, because I want to talk about effective a little bit later, but a legitimate science policy interface for these domains would have to ensure that knowledge is not just credible, but also legitimate, in the sense that it is inclusive of diverse knowledge systems, but also, and this is a step further than what we've seen in existing science policy interfaces, that it supports pluralism. Pluralism not just on the epistemological level, but on the level of frames and ontologies. And as a fourth, there has to be some kind of a chance or a likelihood that such a body will actually be able to support governance. So who's going to be the audience? Can we count on political buy-in, and can such an organization empower diverse actors to take action on the basis of these assessments? So our conclusion and our analysis of the question, do we need a science policy interface for forests, is also very much informed by the fact that we're actually not making a lot of progress in the reform of science. And I appreciated Michael explaining that we see this shift towards different modes of knowledge, co-production, transdisciplinarity, and we see that science is losing some of its authority. But I'd like to contest that claim also. While I recognize the shift, actually there's a lot of fights going on in order to prevent these shifts from actually materializing. And the reason for why natural sciences still dominate the environmental domain is very much related to how related to scientific habits and methods, but also norms about good science and appropriate science policy relations, together with vested interests and academic careers of powerful people. But what we need to remember is that science policy interfaces are seen as effective when knowledge production and knowledge use fit into a shared singular problem frame. So the desire for scientists to have an impact on policy and the desire of policymakers to be able to make use of scientific knowledge is all constrained by this singular problem frame. So in that sense, there is a real tension between effective science policy interfaces and the need for science and research to take a legitimate role in a democratic society, which inevitably has to support plural problem frames. So there's a real tension here. And raising the issue of pluralism is, of course, a major problem for global science policy interface bodies like IPCC or IPBES, because it means that they have to get rid of this shared singular framing of both the research problem and the policy problem. So what would be needed, and this is a bit of a repetition, I think, and I'll close with this. What would be needed in our understanding in science policy interfaces to be legitimate and credible and not just effective in an instrumental sense, is that we need to start thinking about disempowering dominant approaches that continue to reproduce dominant framings without critical reflection on what they are actually supporting. We need to start thinking seriously about empowering critical social sciences and humanities in order to also raise the profile of these marginalized frames. And we need to start promoting collaborative and transdisciplinary research. And for everybody who thinks that we are already doing that, I'd like to remind you again of this notion that natural science approaches still obtain 90% of all the funding, with social sciences often put in a secondary position. And we need to start remaking the science policy contract that it recognizes the politics of knowledge, so that scientists can legitimately ask themselves the question, whose interests are we supporting with our knowledge? Whose interests should we be supporting with our knowledge? And how should we change our practices in order to accomplish that? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther, for this really fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. I see a lot of applause going on. Thank you very much already for the question we have there. For Michael and Esther, I would kindly ask you not to answer them, because I would like to Lucas and Gerhard ask this question live during our debate.
Okay, yeah, now we had the expected, let's say, critical setup for our panel discussion that we now would like to do together with policymakers and scientists with a lot of experience at the science policy interface, as some of our previous speakers. And I'm now thinking that we can already, let's see how it goes, partly engage also Esther and Michael in a discussion. Let's see how it goes. I guess we do this a bit like in a very open setting. But now it's my real pleasure to introduce the first two panelists. The one, unfortunately, isn't here in person, but we have her statement. Anna de Panay-Grünenberg. She's a member of the European Parliament since 2019. And she's very active on forestry, biodiversity, transport and climate policy. She has a background in forestry and environmental sciences from the University of Freiburg. I wasn't aware of that. And the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and had been elected president of the Green Group in the City Council of Stuttgart for 10 years. The second panelist I would like to introduce is also from the University of Freiburg. I think that's the last one from the University of Freiburg as far as I overlook it now. Jürgen Bauhus, I can see him at least already on the screen, so he's there. He's a professor at Freiburg, the chair of silviculture, but he's also a very experienced person at the Science Policy Interface. He's the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board for Forest Policy of the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture. I hope this is still the name of it, that provides, it's listed here, scientifically proven options for political decision in this area of conflict. I'm not sure if Jürgen, if you sent this or someone else has put it here to me, but now you have the possibility to correct this if it's wrong. We look forward to your intro statement, about 2 minutes, to shortly cover a short evaluation of the current science policy interface relating to forests in the EU, how you see this, and then also a kind of catchy vision for the future. So what is your vision on the science policy interface? Jürgen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I actually corrected that text, but obviously got lost in the email traffic. I wouldn't have said scientifically proven options.
I thought so.
Because when we provide advice for policies looking into the future. A lot of things cannot be proven yet. Yeah? They may be plausible options for future. Thank you for the invitation. It's a bit hard after these two excellent presentations that gave such a good insight and critical overview to provide a 2-minute vision. Also as a natural scientist who's grabbing this 90% of the funding, as has been suggested. Well, what I do see when I look at this arena at the European level, I think everyone is aware that we have there deep divisions of advocacy coalitions related to forest policy. On the one side, of course, environment and nature. On the other side, forest and land use. This third large arena developing around climate, which may offer opportunities to overcome some of these deep divisions because of mutual interests on certain issues between these other groups. But there is not really much development in terms of overcoming or changing core beliefs of these advocacy groups. And in this context, I see a lot of sort of ad hoc policy advice that is brought in by these different advocacy coalitions. What I don't see is a more long-term strategic type of advice. And science can play a positive role, but that depends on a lot of conditions that would make that possible. And I think Michael and Esther pointed to many of those. Science can, of course, provide for better informed policymaking and decisions, for perhaps more evidence-based or considering more options, increasing the frame of possible solutions. But that will depend on creating an environment in which also science provides trusted advice. And Michael pointed to the fact that we see also a lack of trust, which is also generated through contradictory statements by different science. In the EU, we see sort of advisory boards like the one that I chair at national levels. And regarding the issues we're dealing with in forestry, we see also advisory boards at the international level, and as I mentioned, the IPCC or IPBES. But yes, there is nothing similar at the EU level. I could imagine something like that at the EU level if it was equally supported by the different advocacy coalitions. If they had a similar say in who would play a role and become part of such a body, it would be necessary to represent the different types of knowledge in terms of disciplines, also types of knowledge, but also regions within Europe. Europe is incredibly diverse, and therefore I think also the regions would have to have a say in who might be involved in such a board or advisory board. What I think is also important is that these people need to be as independent as possible. Now we know that no one is independent, but as independent as possible to actually provide trustful advice. Georg, you wanted to interrupt me?
Yes, it's a bit unfair that you get 2 minutes and the previous speaker 10, but you will have a lot of time to continue. This was super interesting, Jürgen. In the sake of discussion,
that's okay.
The last sentence for you, and then we move on. Then I jump in my second role as Anna Dickmanay Grunenberg, and I also am afraid that my statement is not 2 minutes, so I will read it still. Let's see, because I think it's also very interesting. So as I said, for those that have joined later, Anna couldn't make it. She fell sick today, but she sent us a statement. We had a call with her. It was really a pity, but she's definitely not in the situation to join a panel. Anna wrote, in recent years, the political discourse has changed. I say this in a positive sense. Finally, the advancing climate crisis and massive loss of species are priority topics on the political agenda. Admittedly, with a massive delay, but as we as Germans say, better late than never. With unprecedented speed, the European Commission has set major strategies, at least on paper, declared climate neutrality, environmental protection, and the transformation of our societies as the ultimate goal of the Green Deal. A number of other papers followed, most notably the new biodiversity strategy and a new forest strategy. In the latter, forests were for the first time not only of economic importance, but the immeasurably important ecosystem services of the forest were recognized and their protection explicitly declared as a goal. This change of mind in politics is not least also the success of academia, which has been persistently pointing out the risks and dangers of the climate and biodiversity crisis for, one must say, for decades now. The real question is, how can we get policymakers to react more quickly on scientifically proven facts and translate them into policy? The facts is all these strategies, the European Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy, and so on, might sound good on paper. However, the paper they are printed on are worth noting. If we are not worth noting, obviously, sorry for that, if you don't initiate real change in implementation as well. This means that policymaking politics is only the intermediate stage, the link between academia and practical work on the ground. It sets the framework and it creates the basis for practices that enable us, in this case, to protect or destroy our own livelihoods. We need a more effective way of communication, of faster action and decision-making. Science often produces valuable studies that remain unknown because they are not communicated to the right politicians, or because they are communicated incompletely, incorrectly, or not at all. Policymakers and their teams often have very little time to grasp the issues, and enough lobbies try to pass their known scientific arguments as scientifically sound. Only better communication between policymakers and scientists could alleviate this pressure from the lobbies. My last paragraph, as Anna. Furthermore, the hurdles for cooperation with universities are also too great, where administrative costs are so high that only privately financed institutions are often considered. However, many forest science institutes that are not directly dependent on a university are automatically dependent on third-party acquisition and also do studies for the classical forest industry, turning them to be out not as free as they could be in their research. As a politician, this fact makes it not easy to evolve in such a scientific landscape. Meanwhile, you want to introduce changes. If we want to save the forest, we must act now, and we must act together. Thank you, Anna. I hope I did justice to you. And now we move on to our next panelists.
Yes, exactly. Now I have a great pleasure to introduce Pierre Ibish. I hope he's there. Yes, I can already see him. Pierre is a professor of nature conservation at the Eberswalde University of Sustainable Development. He is a director of the Center of Econics and Ecosystem Management. And also since 2014, he is a member and the vice chair of the German Environmental Foundation. Pierre, please introduce your statement. And thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, Agatha and Georg, thanks a lot for setting up this very interesting panel discussion. Thanks for having me. I am only an ecologist, and I would like to provide my perspective, which I think is concrete and rather practical. It's the perspective of an applied scientist, and I would like to start with your excellent questions. How do we evaluate the science policy interface? And I suggest that we then look at results, at outcomes, such as the European forest strategy. So this is very concrete, and here we can find some evidence that might help us to answer the question. So I know, like, when we do an evaluation, everything depends on our expectation, on our baseline, of course, but let me suggest that well, as a scientist, I expect that such a strategy, which is guiding forest management across the whole continent, reflects science, reflects the state of the art of science, the different fields of science that are relevant, and that all the topics that scientists consider that are relevant are actually covered. So if we then, of course, now in 1 minute, I won't do the complete analysis of the strategy, but if we look, and I invite you, all of you doing this, at the strategy itself, but also the accompanying document, which provides the results of the stakeholder consultation and the evidence base. Yeah, it's combined. I think it's a good example. So there's a problem. So that opinion and science is combined in one document. The document is really short. It's only a handful of papers actually being cited, which then is considered to be the basis for such overarching and highly relevant strategies. This is a problem. So then again, yeah, we would have to look at terms. Evidence has been mentioned very often, evidence-based approaches being problematic, especially when we deal with the future. So actually stuff which is included here is not all about evidence. It's also including naturally projections, for example, selected projections being based on a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of non-knowledge included. And by now we shy away from actually exposing our non-knowledge explicitly. This is very important. So we have to talk not only about uncertainty, but also unknowables, the unknown unknowns, the blind spots, and so on and so forth. And we have clearly to indicate where is it as evidence, where is it just plausible knowledge, and where do we have real non-knowledge. So if we look at the document, I think it's really poor. There are many important topics missing that I expect as an ecologist, non-forestry, forest science related person, such as the impact of forest management on the health of ecosystems. It's not covered. So and then of course the strategy itself is proposing a lot of options of using forest, wood products, and so on, without necessarily providing the knowledge base, like what does it mean if we harvest certain quantities of products in the different forest ecosystems of Europe. So I think it's really it's a pity that the EU forest strategy has not provided like an up-to-date knowledge base, and here we see a need for future development. And now, okay, what can help us in this case? I like a lot. Yes, mechanisms that allow to compile knowledge. Here we know it's a problem whenever we produce a document, it's outdated the day after. So I suggest something, well, maybe new formats, living ecosystem assessments, interactive, web-based, where we can provide findings and come up with arguments, but also present counter arguments. So it's very important to show the disagreements and show the controversies amongst the different scientists. And maybe we can come back to that later in the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and sorry for stopping you. I hope you can bring this argument to the panel debate. We will.
I was inspired by my predecessors and
sorry for that.
Thank you. And now I would like to introduce the next panelist, Herben Jensen. I'm sorry for my very poor Dutch. I will try to improve it. Herben is the international coordinator at Swedish Forestry Agency. He has worked on the European forest policy in the Netherlands, Belgium, Finland, and now in Sweden. His PhD in forestry and agriculture science analyze the communication processes in European forest policy decision-making. Gerben, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me, and I really enjoyed listening to the previous presentations, and especially enjoyed listening to Mikael, because he was many years ago one of the reviewers of my PhD, actually. I actually want to echo the points made by Professor Bauhuis on the difficulties that are posed on us by the functioning of advocacy coalitions, ad hoc work in trying to combine science and policy, the issue of contradictory opinions. I fully agree with this point on the need to have a regional say when it comes to policy decisions. And I also find it extremely difficult to discuss the topic of like value-free or as independent as possible, as Professor Bauhuis said, science. And I also agree with the point raised by Pierre Ibish on his criticism on how the process of the EU forest strategy went, because I've been in this business for a long time, and with the previous two forest strategies, we would normally have national scientists from national forest agencies having many meetings, giving advice to the Commission in drafting a new forest strategy. With the latest one, however, this has not been the case. And actually, with the whole Corona crisis, the opportunities for having meetings have actually also for the European Commission, that was not so digital before the Corona crisis started, have become much more easy. However, scientists and experts from national forest agencies have not at all been involved in the drafting of the EU forest strategy. And I think this is one of the problems also with the science policy interface at the EU level, in the sense that it has, especially during the Corona crisis, everything has developed into some kind of a black box. I'm thinking of examples, the technical experts groups under the sustainable finance taxonomy, where it is the Commission that invites experts. They have a certain limited percentage of that is scientists, and the rest are other invited experts by interest groups. And they can be from any kind. I'm not just saying that it's like environmental or forestry, but they can be from any kind of side. But it's really a black box, because member states are not involved in that. And as a final example on how the science and the policy development at the European Commission works, I would like to give the example of the article in Nature on extremely increased harvesting levels, especially in Sweden and Finland. This article was written by scientists from the European Commission's Joint Research Center and one person from the DG Environment. This was published in Nature, and then afterwards, large conglomerates of forest policy scientists sent in several critical articles refuting the results. The thing is that you never know when something has been published, how it is used. And in our interpretation, the results of this Nature article are being used by the European Commission, in spite of the fact that large groups of scientists refute this and provide all the evidence why the harvesting levels have not increased, for example. So then you have these conflicting opinions, and this is very difficult to deal with.
Unfortunately, I need to ask you to wrap up.
Yeah, I thank you very much for the opportunity. And later on, I hope to, if the question arises, I hope to give you an example of a great experience of mine that I had with a nice science policy interface example. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting intervention, and please keep the answer to that question because it's actually on my list. I really wanted to ask you about that. And now I have a great pleasure again to introduce the last of the panelists for today, Saskia Ozinga. I think she's also already there. Yes, she's there, I can see her. She's environmental and social activist and the founder of the Forest Movement Europe and of the NGO Fern, which she has she coordinated the campaign for them between 1995 and 2017. She has published on forest governance, forest certification, trade and forest, effective advocacy, and forest and climate. Saskia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agatha. I've heard lots of interesting things said already, and I would like to respond to lots of things, but I've only got 2 minutes, so I'll keep it short. When you asked me to speak, first I need to explain I'm not a scientist and I'm not a policymaker. I'm an activist, so I'm full in the civil society group in that sense. And your question was, what is the interface and how do we evaluate the interface between the science, the policy, and society? And I Googled what the word interface exactly means. And that seems to be a point or a space where two systems, organizations, or subjects meet and interact. And if you take that definition, I think you can easily argue that there is no interface between society, policy, and science. Because there is, of course, an interface between policy and science, and there is an interface between policy and NGOs, but there is no policy, no interface between where all these different actors meet. And does that matter? Yes, I think it matters a lot. To requote Anna, the MEP, where she said, if we want to save forest or if we want to improve forest management in Europe, I would add, we really must act now and we must act together. I completely support that sentiment. And I don't think that's happening. And if you want to have a vision or a way forward about how that could be happening, I think we need to look to the example of citizens' assemblies. There are hundreds of citizens' assemblies across the EU on different topics, most of them, of course, on climate. There's none, I just checked yesterday, there's none that deals with forestry issues in Europe. And I think that is a real missing opportunity, which we really could build on to sort of, move forward. I was intrigued by the discussion on the forestry strategy, because I completely agree with Pierre that the forestry strategy is not good enough from an ecological perspective. But I also think it's much, much better than the previous two. And when I hear Gerben say that there was no input on this one and there was a lot of input on the previous one, I wonder, well, maybe then it was a good thing that there wasn't that input. So at least that's a challenging thing to discuss as well. And last, when I was talking with Agatha at the beginning of the week about this discussion, it just happened that I saw a tweet from an academic who said, if you are an academic and want to help in dealing with the climate crisis, you should completely reject policy as a framework. Policy is just sanding around the edges of a problem, which is at the root of policy making itself as a system. And that's a very radical position. And I'm not even sure I agree with it. At least, I spent 20 years of my life influencing EU policy making. So that would be a waste of my time if I would agree with it. But I also think there's a lot of truth in that statement as well, because we face a crisis in European forests and globally in climate, and we have to act together and very fast. And we know that all the policies that are being made at the moment and that are in place at the moment, the Green Deal, et cetera, are not going to solve those problems as they are. So I'll leave it at that for now as a starting point. Thank you.
Great, excellent, Saskia, and also nice to see you again after quite some time. Actually, normally the panelists that spoke last can recover a bit after the intro, but I would like to start with you, because you probably have the longest experience with the non-existing science policy society interface in the EU. My question is just for you, Saskia. What is your best and what is your worst experience with scientists in your career as a known policymaker, so to say? If you need a minute, we go to next speaker and I come back to you.
I think the best experience I have with science policymaking interface at the EU is this outpouring by scientists on the whole bioenergy debate. I think there have been several letters, signed by, I think, up to hundreds of scientists challenging the EU position on bioenergy being carbon neutral. And I think that was very positive and is an important discussion to be had. And I think that definitely in the sort of last few years, that's the most positive I've seen. The most negative is that I think when you look at particularly the positioning of the highly forested countries in the EU, in the discussion on sustainable forest management that we never got beyond looking really at sustainable forest management in a sort of way that is also ecologically, socially, and economically viable. And the sort of economic dominance has been very dominant in all those years I've been working on EU forest policies. And what Esther said about looking at the science power, the power interface is really, really important. And I think that's been very prevalent in European forest policies for decades.
Thank you, Saskia. I just put one question to each of you, and then I think we should open up. You please put your comments in the questions and answers. I think there are many things in the chat, but for Gata, me, it's not so easy to organize this. Put it in the question and answer, so we open up for a kind of public debate already. I would like to start my one question comment now with Jürgen, because Jürgen, you said something quite interesting, that there is a bit of a lack of a strategic vision for the future of the science policies / society ? Interface. And of course, I like you referring to the silos and the advocacy coalitions. And I've been wondering, as you have the experience in the German Waldpolitik Beirat, do you think that how do you see that in this regard? Does it work? What is the limitations? And could it be something that you think could be replicable at EU level, or exactly not? And is it sort of the strategic thing that you would see there? Also talking about the siloed science advocacy.
Those were a lot of questions, Georg.
Yeah, just choose the one that you would like to answer at that point of the day. Yeah, basically, what can we learn from that experience? And do you think it's transferable at the EU level? Perhaps this is a shorter version.
Well, I think Germany is complex enough, and I think at the European level, it would be to the power of 2 or more in terms of complexity. But I think that the advisory board that I have the privilege to share works quite well in the sense that we are independent scientists. That was not always the case. The board evolved more as a sort of stakeholder board, where all the members had a doctor and a professor in front of their name, but they were not necessarily scientists. And that made it, of course, more difficult to have also a joint learning. There's this famous saying that's attributed to many people that goes, if you have the feeling that you are the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. And I must say that I've never felt that I was in the wrong room, fortunately, because I've learned a lot from this very interdisciplinary makeup that we have, and also representing different regions within Germany and different backgrounds. And that has helped a lot. And it certainly, I think, helps to communicate also science and recommendations, because a lot of the arguments for and against evidence is resolved internally within such a board. So what you actually issue has been digested a lot more. And of course, we have seen this in the debates about the corona and all the different scientists that spoke up there in favor of one or the other strategy. There was often this lack of internal discussions. And in Germany, only at the end of this pandemic, they have created a board that brought the scientists together to advise the government. And I think this can work. We, in our advisory board, have certainly, I think, written a few expertises that have a more long-term perspective, while we also respond sometimes on more actual challenges and sort of to relate to current policy questions. But for example, the expertise that we wrote on climate change mitigation, or more recently, the one that we released towards the end of last year on climate change adaptation, they have been, in my view, received very well. We still get invited, many members of us, to report on this to all sorts of sectors of society. Uli Schrammel, for example, told me yesterday has been invited by a mountain biking association to talk about the outcomes of this report, which I think illustrates to me that this also is taken up by all sorts of sectors of society, some of which we didn't even anticipate, and not only at the policy level.
Okay, thank you, Jürgen. So basically a bit an argument for having a bit of free academic debate and resolve discussion points and then come up with a kind of informed opinion. I would like to continue with Pierre, because you said many interesting things. And one interesting thing you said at the end is this, how to deal with dissent and different opinions within science. And you mentioned this showed a disagreement. Do you think this is enough happening at the science policy interface? Now, be it Germany, be it EU in forestry, and how could it be done?
No, I think it does not happen, and maybe we can still stick to the German example. As a matter of fact, I'm German as well. I would not agree to all points put forward by Jürgen Bauhus. So I remember some products of this advisory board, some documents where we have also like responded and well highlighted that some literature was missing, and yes, there was sometimes an incomplete presentation of the topics. Yeah, and maybe this has to happen when you have a reduced group, a limited group of people, clearly interdisciplinary and a little diverse. But this is not the open process I would envision, like, and where we have an internal discussion, as it was said, and everything is digested and filtered. And then, yes, you have a document on mitigation of climate change where bioenergy is not reflected critically, or where like papers on substitution which criticize the numbers which are out there are not mentioned. So this is something exactly what we have to avoid. And therefore, I feel we need more open mechanisms. I feel that, yeah, of course, a government is free to have an advisory board, a minister, and so on, but this is nothing that can represent the overall scientific community, because it starts with the question who is appointed. No, and we have many scientists who work on forests and who have interesting things maybe to contribute, but who would not consider to be part of such an advisory group because they do not work in forest science. So again, I plea for coming up with some innovative ideas, maybe do some web-based experiments. Clearly something like that must be moderated by different independent scientists from different disciplines, I guess, who then can present or like moderate this presentation also of controversies. Like there is a topic and then there is a paper, like this example of Swedish harvesting or whatever, and then of course there are the responses, and this has to be presented together, and then there will be the finding. There is disagreement, and maybe, but in some papers there were mistakes, so the counter arguments are less valid, and so on and so forth. Something like that is more transparent and allows for policymakers and society to have more insights in what science is. Science is by nature not producing consensus. No, and science is not about voting. Like it's not the majority win. Sometimes it's the outsider that comes up with the evolution theory or something like that. So we have to be careful with democracy and internal digesting.
Thank you, Pierre. I think that is really interesting, also having in mind the different ideas that Michael and also Esther introduced with pluralism and democracy and how it relates to science and different opinions. I have a last question for Gerben. He can still, Gerben, tell us your good example. And then I think we open up. We have many questions and comments, and I'm sure we should not do this now exclusively amongst us. Gerben, what was the good example?
In 2018, we had a ministerial meeting on boreal forest with the 6 boreal forest countries, like the big forest countries in the world. And there is such a thing called the International Boreal Forest Research Association, where scientists from those 6 countries, the US, Canada, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia, most of their forest scientists are members. And then we decided to have a science policy interface. Many months before that, the scientists were asked to put on paper the big questions that they're working on. At the same time, policymakers from those 6 countries were asked to put on paper the big questions that they're struggling with. And then the day before the ministerial meeting, civil servants at my level and a little bit higher level came together with the scientists from the IFPRA, a big group. And then we both presented the questions that scientists are working on and that they want to answer, and the questions that we as policymakers are struggling with. And then we together decided on a short list of questions that we both thought needed answering. We presented this to the ministers the day after, and then the ministers made that short list even shorter. And afterwards, countries gave funding to the scientists to come up with a compendium, like of the state of the art, not doing new research, but compile all the research that is already there and try to present all that knowledge. And luckily, last year, the first of those products have been delivered. And I actually thought that exercise was very fruitful, because normally the problem is that policymakers ask for a simple answer to a difficult question, and scientists want to answer a difficult question with a lot of scenarios. And with such a compendium of the state of the art with different answers, actually gives fruit to a whole new policy discussion, because we have to try to start understanding that simple questions for policymakers cannot get a simple answer always. So and this process is continuing, and we're actually very happy with this.
Thanks, Cam, for introducing that. I hope that not all the money went to the natural sciences then, quoting one of the previous speakers. We should now really open up. We have interesting questions.
Yeah, maybe before moving to the questions from the chat, I would like to ask our panelists if they would like to answer to each other, or if they have any comments on the other statements by other panelists. If it's not the case, you can always jump in later. Please feel free to do that. And now I would like to give the floor to Lucas Gissen, who posted 2 questions in the chat. Please try to, I would not say maybe focus on the one first, and then let's see if we have a time for the other one. Please, Lucas, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agatha, and most notably, thank you to the presenters from very different perspectives, but I think also doing a very big justice to a huge research program that has emerged in the forest sciences and applied research field over the last 10-15 years or so. I think the framing of this session is quite coarse. Yeah, we take a simple formula, science policy interface, and behind this is hiding a lot of nuances. And if we take forest research, I'm not saying forest sciences, but I'm saying forest research, then the reality is much more nuanced. We do have scientific research, we do have more applied research, we do have more agency-oriented or consultancy research. We even have journalistic research, as we can see in different sessions in this conference as well. So it's quite nuanced, and these different types of research are capable of doing different things, and they are limited in not doing and delivering others. And then at the same time, I think policy and science have very different mandates in a democratic society, but also in non-democratic things. And if we don't keep them somehow apart, I'm not saying let's not them talk to one another, but if we don't keep them apart, we are risking to jeopardize either or both of them in the long run. So the mandate and the nature of science, at least, is slow. And Agatha introduced that policymakers need quick and swift answers. So I have to say, sorry, I cannot deliver this. In EFI, I could deliver this more swiftly. In university, I can't. So I think we should be also aware of limitations and really not leave our core mandates and core capabilities that each one of us is able to deliver. So I think my call would be, or my comment would be, to really capitalize on this idea of think tanks, of research centers, of forstliche Versuchsanstalten, as the German-speaking colleagues might know.
Experimental stations.
Experimental stations, thank you, Jürgen, to really see how we can mandate them to come with swiftly research-based, but by nature not scientific, not fully fledged scientific answers. But, and this is my last point, this needs additional funding. This needs additional, this is an additional task in our pluralist democratic societies, and this needs to be acknowledged in some ways for not cannibalizing ourselves with different mandates over funding, which is trying to serve a particular mandate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucas. I see it rather as a comment than a question, but maybe one of our panelists would like to pick up on that. I also invite Michelle and Esther to join this discussion if they feel like this is something they would like to comment on. Any comments from the panel on that? Please, it's very welcome. Yes, Jürgen, please.
Yeah, very, very briefly. I mentioned that I see in particular a lack of sort of long-term strategic policy advice in contrast to the more ad hoc to pressing problems. And that really touches on some of the points that Lucas mentioned too. To provide that, you need this kind of either think tanks or centers and so on that can work on these long-term issues and develop these things over time. And if you do this in advisory boards, you do this on your spare time, typically. There's no reward for that whatsoever. And some of these panels are well resourced with sort of staff, additional academic staff that support also lead scientists in these panels. And this is, I think, what is absolutely necessary, because providing advice sort of on a regular basis without sufficient resources is in the long term not sustainable. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Any more comments on that? I see Gerben is there, please.
Thank you very much. Let me switch on my video. And when it comes like to the selection of scientists, I think at the national level, these things would normally be resolved in a more holistic kind of way, because at the highest level, when you would have a parliamentary inquiry committee, automatically the composition of your national parliament and in the selection of scientists, because let's be honest, that's what politics does. A political party does select the scientists that represent their opinions. They try to select well-known scientists, but there's also some works going on in selecting scientists that represent your political views in the best kind of way.
Can you be more specific, Gavin?
No, but however, if you have a parliamentary inquiry committee, that means that all political parties are represented, and the choice is made by all parties in parliament. And that actually means that the committee that is selected, a large committee, would represent all of the interests, all of the views, and several of the mainstream views as well. So that's why I believe that normally these national processes where everybody knows the different interests and different views, the different scientific schools are represented, it's at some point you reach a compromise. Not everybody is going to be happy, but probably everybody is going to be equally unhappy, which is normally the definition of a good compromise. Yeah. Even in science, because we know that science is not value free. I heard that being said before by other speakers. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Igor, do you have a comment?
No, Esther has
I saw Esther, exactly. Esther, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, I thought that I would perhaps come in on a couple of things that were said. Certainly, science is not neutral. And I agree with Lucas that there needs to be a separation, and that separations and divisions of labor and carefully thinking about who does what in a democratic society is a really useful thing to do. The common mistake that is made, and I really see this as a mistake because it creates problems, is to kind of associate this distinction between knowledge and decision making, or knowledge and policy and society, as a distinction between facts and values. And I think that that's a mistake to create such a strong alignment between that. I guess that so if you recognize the role of framing, not just in selecting topics, in the research questions, but also in the interpretation of results, if you kind of recognize that role of framing, you will also see that advocacy coalitions, as was mentioned as a term, are not necessarily about picking the scientists that shares your political views, or there is a legitimate difference. This is not just all about political manipulation. And as soon as we start to recognize that even if people say quite different things about the reality that they study, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have been corrupted by values or corrupted by political interest. It is that they're talking about fundamentally different realities that are represented by quite different ways of knowing. So that, I think, helps understanding of the importance of pluralism, not to distinguish the politicized people from the proper scientists, but to recognize that people are simply talking about very different things, and they really do live in different worlds. There's not just one forest.
Thank you very much, Esther. I see Pierre raise his hand, please.
Thanks. I would like to come back briefly to these issues brought up by Jürgen Bauhus and Lukas Gießen as well. So like that we need more time, classical point of scientists, of course, we should avoid ad hoc advice. We need long-term strategic visions. So I have to say, from an applied scientist view, I'm struggling with this. This is not related to the reality which we are facing now. If we look at Germany, for example, where we have this dieback of forests, plantations, hundreds of thousands of hectares, this is happening fast. And then if I look at the evidence document of the EU strategy, there is a section on salvage logging, for example, and the last sentence is further work is needed to acquire information on natural disturbances and salvage loggings. So, okay, we need more time, but in meanwhile, the areas are cleared. And irreversible action is taking place, and the question is: are we able to provide some guidance? Are we willing? And then, of course, ad hoc advice does not necessarily mean evidence-free, as there is so much knowledge about what clear cuts mean, and there are papers on salvage logging and so on and so forth. So I feel we have to come back to this issue. I'm thankful that it was brought up, like these different types of science, research, and so on. We have different velocities, and this depends on what's going on. But let us get accustomed to a more hectic life under climate change.
Thank you very much, Pierre. I see some hands raised. I will give the floor now to Michael, and after that Jürgen, and then to Gerhard. So Michael, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I guess I would also agree with many of the statements that were made previously. But I still see that many of the statements were broad, talk about science policy interfaces, and meet again or discuss the question of whether we need a new science policy panel or board or whatever. And I would really argue against having that. Even now, maybe the colleagues at EFI won't be especially happy about such a statement, but I would see more a need for a science policy and society, let's call it ecosystem or environment. So not put all the eggs into one basket and create one high-level panel and then be surprised that this panel doesn't deliver as expected. But rather, and what I mean with a science society policy ecosystem, I mean that it's various places in which this consultancy is taking place. I like this idea of Pierre's to also experiment with innovative formats, which are more open for contestation, pluralistic, maybe contradictory. I would not be afraid of contradiction. So science must not speak with one voice. That's not the strength. That's what brings strength to science. Then also bringing different subjects on board. So the who question, and especially the framing, the question who sets the agenda. And I have understood your criticism to the EU forest strategy, mainly that the agenda is mainly set by one sector. So it's a strategy not just for one sector, but the contestation comes from other sectors. And why not take other sectors, other actors on board already in the advisory experience? So that would be my claim in a sense. Yeah, and I guess I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Michael. My comment would be that the challenge with the EU forest strategy is perhaps that it was not any more developed by the sector that had developed it up to now. I would really like to intervene shortly and just ask all the PhD students, postdocs that are hopefully still following us to put their question in. And there aren't bad questions because there's so many different views here and so different ideas of science, policy, society interactions. That's just an encouragement. We continue now with Jürgen. But please use the time, dare something, put a question in, and you will get different answers for sure. So this is just an encouragement. Over to you again, Agatha.
Yes, so I'm just giving the floor to Jürgen, please.
Yeah, very briefly, directly to Pierre. I don't want to be misunderstood that I'm saying that, say, sort of short-term or sort of, current day advice on pressing issues has a lower value. Or shouldn't be done. It's to the opposite. This has to be done, of course, as well, or we should provide that. But in this context, we shouldn't forget about long-term and strategic thinking and complement that. And I'm saying that because it gets so easily forgotten with all the crises that we deal with and the pressing issues that we have. So just a point of clarification there.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to give the floor to Gerhard Weiss from BOKU, who asked a question in the chat, but also raised his hand in the meantime. Gerhard, are you ready? Yes, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm here, and many thanks. And this debate is really fascinating. And Lucas said, okay, we have to look more differentiated at the thing. And I do the vice versa. I tried to simplify it somehow, maybe in a way, okay, what does it mean to me when I followed that? And for me, the most interesting, well, it started with Sina Leipold in the morning with the narratives, and then Michael and Esther, when what they are saying, if we take this seriously, they say knowledge is deeply political. And I come then to well, I want to summarize my statement to 3 hypotheses that for me seem to disagree with some of the statements here. Because one thing which is often said is that science needs long time to come to conclusions and we cannot answer quickly. I want to challenge that. And I explain it by this. Well, we have the universities, and as long as there are the current funds for doing research, yes, there are so many experts and we have the knowledge. So the problem is not so much that we don't know enough. Very often when the policy decisions are missing or wrong or whatever, usually they are missing. Yeah, it's not that the knowledge is not there. And I would say, yes. So if they want, if the policy makers, well, I agree that policy is a different field than science, and science is not responsible for coming up with the solutions or with a common view. That's the political responsibility. And if they want, then they can have it. They can have it quickly. They would listen to Michael or some and say, okay, they don't even need to listen to us. They would have to be bold and invite the different views and all the different disciplines to a panel, to one day. And I'm sure that for the pandemic and for the forest problems and for climate change, within one day they would have their answers if they would be bold enough to invite the different views to one table and just decide it. And there are a few examples somehow where this worked, but in many cases, isn't it so that just we can propose whatever we want as scientists, and we can propose these formats. Yes, we know it anyway. It's just that policies often, policies are often not wanting to do it. Okay, so now everybody is silent. So maybe this is, it's formulated like a comment, but maybe as a challenge for reaction. So because now I would want to hear some reactions again. Am I going in the right directions? Did I understand Michael and Esther correctly? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. Do we have any immediate responses or comments on that? I will give you 2 or 3 minutes to digest that and to think about your feedback on that. And I would like to give the floor to Laura Secco. She also would like to share her comment. I think you should be able to share your screen now. Yes, you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you also for allowing me to contribute to this very interesting debate. I had a comment related to what Gerben mentioned. He stated in his first part of the talk that we are observing conflicting opinions as a scientist. And I was asking myself whether we should try to provide, rather than conflicting opinions, maybe science-based divergent facts. And of course, we are scientists and we bring with us our background, our visions of the world, our culture, our willingness to act in a certain direction. But what I think we are observing also in the recent years is that the political willingness is taking what they want to get, and they are using the science and the scientific results according to their willingness and their main interests. So what is driving the decisions is not science, is not what we as scientists think are relevant. The politicians are taking what they think is useful for them. and they decide on the basis of what is better for them. And I was very much surprised by Horizon 2020 project. Maybe you know it's Magic, that was creating the Uncomfortable Knowledge Hub. And in this project, they were pointing out the role of uncomfortable knowledge. So what is considered to be marginal, what is not in the mainstream, what is not dominant, and what is not taken into consideration, because there is a need to simplify for the policy decisions, and the simplification allow politicians and policymakers just to extract what they need for their own uses. I don't know if I was creating more confusion than the others, but I had this in mind, sorry.
Thank you very much, Laura, for sharing this interesting comment. I would like to see if we have any responses from the panelists to that comments. I especially would like to ask Gerben, because I know that he needs to leave a little bit earlier. So maybe he would like to comment briefly on the ongoing discussion. If not, Gor can take over.
Okay, I'm not sure if you hear or whispering here with our co-moderation. Even so, we have really tried to engage the PhD students and postdocs. At least I can't see any question. If there would be any urgent questions still coming from the chat, we could take one more or two. If not, I would think it would be really nice. We had a real big range of topics and a different understandings also of the role of science at the science policy/society interface. I have noted down some things, like for me also like this question of boundary making between science, society and policy making vis-a-vis pluralism, how this could be organized. Also looking into the future, because it's on one hand easy to say we have to have this plural knowledge. At the same time, then there was processes mentioned of building scientific consensus or maintaining the boundaries. So I'm a bit wondering how can this work together also with the pluralism within science and the pluralism within society. And then I really like this uncomfortable knowledge hub, which I think sounds very fancy to me. Basically, what I would like now the panelists to do is to think a bit after one night of sleeping, when tomorrow you will be called by someone from the EU Commission. Well, very fancy, interesting debate yesterday. What should we do now in the future? How should the science, society, policy interactions, let's call it like that, how should it look like in 10 years? What would be your answer on the phone? And I will give you 2 minutes to think about it. And we also invite our very great keynote speakers. And I guess we start perhaps with Saskia, because she has perhaps the longest experience and she has been quite silent following this also inner science debates we had here. But first a minute to relax. And then your response to the EU Commission guy, how should we do this in the future? Science, policy, society interface, of course, relating to forests.
And when you are
was it anyhow clear what I said, or do I need food?
I hope so, it was clear. And I will use this minute of break or the moment for taking your thoughts together to check if our graphical recording can be shared with us. There were some problems ongoing on the back, but maybe Alex, you can try to share your screen and maybe, if possible, unmute yourself and tell us a little bit. I'm looking at Maria if it's possible. We will see. If not, we will just give you 45 more seconds to think about your final statement.
Which means that all the complexity of this debate is put into one nice graphical recording. So if you have any questions, you just have to open it once it's ready.
Yes.
And you will understand all the different ways of arguments we have heard. Okay, somehow this doesn't seem to work right now.
Yes, but do not worry, we will share it with you after the debate. Oh, yes, it's
something's
working.
Happening.
Something is working.
Hopefully the internet has not collapsed. Or...
We see your desktop, Alex. Yes, now we can see your graphic. Can you unmute yourself and tell us a few words about it, or is your mic not working? Not. Not working.
Yeah, but it's very self-explanatory, I think, what you can see here.
The graphic is really amazing, and we definitely share this with our panelists and all participants. So great work, Alex.
And it's not ready yet, because you have a chance as a panelist, at least, to still influence it. So I suggest we move back to our panel. And I would like to first call in my now third role here tonight as a EU Commission person, Saskia. Saskia, you have been in this fancy debate yesterday evening. What would be your recommendation? How should we organize this in the future? The science policy, society interface on forests in Europe.
Well, I think 10 years is way too long anyway. And I think we need to realize that we're in a crisis. We need to act now. And I think none of us, and that includes myself, actually really realizes the crisis we're in. I think, that's the first thing I think to say. And I think the second thing I would say is I really think that these, I think we don't listen enough to citizens. We talk a lot here about policy and science interface. We don't really talk at all about citizens. And I think policymakers, they have to listen to citizens, and they need to listen to citizens much more. And we need to try to get citizens to really understand issues. We always think people don't know things when they haven't studied things, but that is clearly not true. And I think if you look at the experience that we do have with these citizens' assemblies, particularly on climate change, and particularly in the UK, which is the case I know best, then it's very clear that these citizens' assemblies really do work. And you give them you give people the right information, and this is a selected group of people which represent society as a whole, and then they make recommendations which are very sensible for policymakers. The problem in the UK with the climate assemblies at the moment is that the policymakers then do nothing with that, and that's of course where the whole thing falls flat. So if you get citizens' assemblies which have the power to tell policymakers what to do on European forest issues, I think that would be a really step forward. And of course, these citizens' assemblies need to be informed properly by scientists. And of course, there are different opinions and different understandings of how things work and don't work, and there's different power imbalances, but that can all be worked out and worked through. And in a way that really citizens feel empowered to think about things and get involved in things and make decisions about things and tell policymakers which way to go. And I think that really is the way we should be going to. And not in 10 years' time, but tomorrow.
Okay, thanks for stressing the urgency, Saskia. And also thanks for bringing the citizen element back. I thought this Gerben example, it would have been cool to have a third group, like a citizen parliament in these 6 countries discussing also questions and issues, would have been a nice addition to the example he brought up. Is Gerben still there? Because I would like to give him the floor next. But I know he has some urgency in the evening. Gerben, are you there?
I don't think so.
Okay, he left already.
Maybe, can I say one more thing?
Yes.
Sure.
I don't know if you know Kit Prince. I mean, I would think a lot of you would know Kit Prince because he was the chief of the UNECA for a long time. And he just published this article in Forest Policy and Economics. I don't know if you've seen it, where he basically says that the whole current science policy interface is a disaster and it's not working. And what we really need is a common, as he said, a common platform of basic facts and analysis on which to base strategies. And he calls for the creation of a forum, a convening of a forum, which I thought was interesting. And he leaves out citizens and NGOs from his analysis. But the fact that he, coming from a sort of, much more timber-centric perspective than I would come from, at some way also says it isn't working, we need sort of a more forum discussion, I think was interesting. So I would urge everybody to read that article and comment and start a discussion about that too. And then don't forget to bring citizens in the whole discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Saskia. This is an excellent recommendation. And I see the editor-in-chief of the journal already being happy about this advertising.
Yes, but I have to say it's not published as a scientific article. It's published as a commentary policy forum. So we make this distinction and discrimination. But Saskia, I think it's a very valuable contribution from Kit.
So we see Lucas is really strong in the boundary marcation tonight. I would like to continue now with who was next. I think it was, if you turn around the order.
There will be Gerben Pierre.
Pierre, what do you call the commission guy calling you? Well, let's say in the next time, not only 10 years.
Well, I come pretty much from systems, looking ever more at these messy, complex, unpredictable socio-ecological systems. And in this case, like coming back to my proposal for such a more inclusive, more open, more dynamic platform, I would like to echo what Michael said. It's a great idea to create such a knowledge ecosystem involving citizens, scientists, and policy. And I feel this would do more justice to the complex ecosystems that forests are. I feel always that we can mimic a little like this natural complexity and mechanisms. And I feel we can learn for knowledge management from ecosystems as well. this is possibly a little academic for this message to a policymaker, maybe not. Let's see. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. And I suggest we move on to Michael, because he has been addressed as the creator of this idea. Michael, what would you tell our friend from the Commission?
Yeah, I mean, if someone from the Commission would call me first, I guess I would remind them of the fact that they have actually come up with quite some interesting models and proposals. And what I'm thinking of at the moment is, for example, this Horizon 2020 initiative of science with and for society, which was experimenting in a sense with really interesting formats. But the critique that I would bring to this program is that it was too playful in a sense. So they experimented with many interesting methods, and what therefore my suggestion would be use some of the insights gained out of this Science with and for Society program and bring it to the grounds and sectoralize it. And I guess very few of these ideas that are brought in this program have never reached the sectors like the forestry sector, and that would be my recommendation. So build on some of the insights that you smart EU Commission people have already dared to invent and dared to bring.
Okay, so basically do your homework first before calling me. Thank you, Michael. We stay in Freiburg. Jürgen, what would you say?
Well, I must say I like this idea of this ecosystem approach. I just don't know how it would work and how you would organize it. It sounds rather fancy, but how you would install that, maybe I'm just lacking imagination. If I still believe that there's a role to play for more technical and rational model approaches, like Michael also portrayed. And I think if the EU Commission wanted that kind of approach, something like that could be relatively quickly be implemented, but it would require a broad support, from the different institutions, and would have to be carried by, as I called it, the different sort of advocacy groups. So I think it's possible. I think there would be some merit. I'm not saying it should be the only thing, but it could be one component of an overall approach, and maybe perhaps play one part of the ecosystem that Michael then generates.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Now, Esther, it's up to you. I know you are a biologist by training a long time ago, so you know about ecosystems. Bring this all together in your statement. What would you call this guy when he calls you after having called the 6 others? Hopefully he's still open for ideas.
Yeah, so what I would say is, and drawing on my own research and experience, particularly in IPPES, where there was this attempt, and it's a serious and genuine effort to create more diversity in this science policy interface. What I would probably say is that that the idea of effectiveness as a criterion to evaluate science policy society relations needs to go out of the window. If you feel that everything, both from the perspective of a scientist and from the perspective of a knowledge user, if you feel that everything you're hearing, that you understand this well, that you can use it and that it's relevant, you're not doing a good job. So if you're having fun and you're comfortable, this is probably because you excluded frames. And it's probably because you excluded forms of knowledge that would challenge the problem frame you're working from or the research frame that you are working from. So the idea, and this is why I like the uncomfortable knowledge hub, a legitimate science policy interface is makes you uncomfortable, because you hear things that you do not want to hear, and you hear things that you really, really do not understand. And I think that's a moment to hang on to. not to try to solve that too quickly by coming to a consensus or by creating this one big integrated framework to rule all of the different perspectives. And those are very common responses by scientists as well as policymakers. But they will again crush the diversity and the genuine pluralism that you need to create legitimate solutions that actually work for the diverse actors that can benefit from knowledge. It's not just the policy elites. So very much in agreement with everything that was said before, actually.
Thank you, Esther. Then if I come back to what you said, I hope we are not too happy after this debate, but still I hope that we are a bit happy, because I think that was really interesting. It was very diverse. It was partly also challenging, because what I always observe in these types of debate, coming back to narratives, that we of course use also different jargons and we use different terms. And one of the challenges in these type of science policy or inter-science disciplinary debates is also to understand each other and to come to an agreement on the language and the jargon. I think this has been working perfectly, and there have been a lot of really interesting ideas coming to the system idea, uncomfortable knowledge, hub the pluralism versus science boundary work. And the only thing I was a bit missing is the rebellic questions by people saying, hey guys, what to do with that? But we had some panelists that really made this and put us a bit let's say the finger in the wound. You cannot say this in English, probably. No,
I'm not sure now.
No, so probably that a good job to remind us about some of the urgencies of the issues we are discussing this. My job is just to say thank you very much.
I see that actually we have a Lucas with a hand. I don't know if we still have a time to pick it up.
Lucas, if you're very brief, you can also...
You need to be very brief. We are giving you 45 seconds.
Well, thank you very much. I just heard Georg saying he was missing some critical interventions, and I thought, in the good old tradition, also in that office where you are located now, I could make a small appeal to researchers, because what policymakers do, I cannot and might not want to influence too much. But as researchers, and then applied or consultancy or journalists or scientific researchers in different mandates with different capabilities, I like the point that Esther made. Whose interest do we support? Get aware of this. Whose interest do we support with our knowledge? And then personal question, do we like this? Do you like to support this? But even more importantly, I would appeal, or I would plead to the researchers. Check if you support a narrow set of alternatives, of policy alternatives to be decided or finally legitimated through your expertise, or are you serving a sort of broadening of alternatives, thinking outside the box, providing different options? But at least this is what I do. I do not expect then to follow my recommendation, but to take account of the hopefully bigger plurality of alternatives that we can provide at applied research and at scientific research levels.
Well, great. Thank you, Lucas, for another really interesting concluding statement. I think we can tell our person from the commission that there are more people she or he could call. But now I should really come to the thank you. And I would really like to start with thanking all the panelists who did an awesome job, and our keynote speakers also did an awesome job of joining this adventure. I think it was really insightful. It was really interesting, also because it was not only the usual social scientist discussion we had at the International Forest Policy meeting, but we had people from policy making, and we had people from other disciplines that know a lot about science policy interactions. I also would like to thank IFPI for all the technical support. We have colleagues around here and the colleagues working on that. This has been working very well, as well, I guess, as the funders of the conference. And then I need to make an announcement, or did I forget?
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Everything is perfect. Maybe I will just remind you that the graphic recording will be shared with you, because Alex did an awesome job. You already saw a trailer. So please stay tuned. We will still share this with you later.
And he will draft an ecosystem, I think.
Hopefully.
Yeah, if you think this is all very nice, but very Eurocentric, tomorrow morning you have the opportunity to be bigger. We will have a really interesting start tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock with a really interesting keynote presentation by Professor Kalami Fobise. We will talk about science policy practice continuum in tropical forest policy. So if you don't have enough of this tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, you have another possibility. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Agatha.
Yes, thank you to
I
our
think we look
panelists.
prepared. Huh?
Yes, we look prepared. We were not so good with keeping the time, but in the end it worked well. Thank you so much. It was really great event, and we're really looking forward to see you tomorrow in the morning.
Have a nice evening.
Bye bye.